The Weight of Empty Hands: Healing Beyond the Hold. About the author, human rights activist Marcia BNoose. Author, born as Marcia Anita Hobbs in Rose Park, Adelaide, South Australia, 25th April 1984. Joining in 2015, Le Droit Humain Co-Freemasonry, Lodge 406. When the most honest thing you can ever say is the oddest thing you will ever say, I wouldn't change a day or have it any other way. Marcia Anita Hobbs aka Marcia BNoose, anything but ordinary. Judgment and perception have no value here. Autobiographical series. Enjoy. Dedication to everyone I love and to justice for all. For everyone who believes in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, shall good always prevail over evil. Acknowledgements to the survivor, victim, child, adult, or other. I see you, I hear you, together we make a better world. Marcia Anita Hobbs. The Weight of Empty Hands. Healing Beyond the Hold: Human Rights Matter. Copyright Marcia Anita Hobbs BNoose. 2026. This work depicts actual events in the life of the author as truthfully as recollection permits. This is a work of nonfiction. No names have been changed, no characters invented, no events fabricated. The right of Marcia Anita Hobbs BNoose to be identified as the author of this work has been asserted by the author in accordance with the Copyright Act 1968, Sect 35, Ownership of Copyright in Original Works, AUS. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, or otherwise, without the prior permission of the author and/or publishers. Any person who commits any unauthorized act in relation to this publication may be liable to criminal prosecution and civil claims for damages. The Weight of Empty Hands. Healing Beyond the Hold. ISBN 9781764206655 www.barbwarenoose.com. Barbwire Noose Registered Thai Limited, Australia. Disclaimer: the information provided in The Weight of Empty Hands. Healing Beyond the Hold is intended for educational, emotional empowerment, and informational purposes only. While this book deeply explores the psychological, emotional, and spiritual impacts of releasing toxic dynamics, trauma, and heavy life burdens, it does not constitute formal psychological, medical, or mental health advice. The emotional processes described, such as navigating grief, disorientation, and the echoing void, are drawn from the author's extensive personal experience in human rights advocacy, activism, and trauma survival. The content herein should not be used as a substitute for professional mental health counseling or therapy. If you are experiencing overwhelming psychological distress or navigating severe trauma, you are strongly encouraged to consult with a qualified, licensed mental health professional. Additionally, while the author draws upon the study of the law and dedicated human rights activism, any references to legal frameworks, statutes, including the Public Interest Disclosure Act, or institutional policies do not constitute formal legal counsel. Laws and protections vary significantly by jurisdiction and are subject to change. If you are facing unlawful enforcement, navigating the legal system, or require specific legal representation, you must consult with a qualified, licensed attorney in your area. The author and publisher specifically disclaim any liability or responsibility for any loss, damage, emotional distress, or legal consequences incurred as a direct or indirect result of the use or application of any contents of this book. Introduction. The anatomy of the drop. We are often told that letting go is an act of simple subtraction. Society, self-help gurus, and well-meaning friends offer a tidy math equation. Drop the weight you are carrying, and immediately you will become lighter. They promise a gentle drifting away, like a leaf detaching from an autumn tree, resulting in instant, peaceful serenity. But they do not tell you about the vertigo. The Weight of Empty Hands. Healing Beyond the Hold is an exploration of the profound, often terrifying paradox of release. It is written for anyone who has spent an agonizing amount of their life's energy gripping a situation, a relationship, or an outdated identity until their knuckles turned white. When you finally pry your fingers open, whether by choice, exhaustion, or the sheer force of a survival instinct pulling the emergency ripcord, the immediate sensation is not peace. It is a freefall. For so long, the tension of your burden became your very posture, and the weight of it became your center of gravity. What happens when the roaring anxiety of maintaining that burden suddenly vanishes, replaced by a deafening, echoing void? What happens when the emotional anesthesia wears off, leaving you to face the raw, unmedicated ache of the present? This book does not ask you to simply drop your chains and run blindly into the sun. Instead, it invites you to honor the phantom limbs of the soul. It asks you to look back at the version of yourself who held on for too long, not with contempt, but with profound, aching reverence for the impossible weight they carried. Healing beyond the hold requires a fundamental shift, moving from the singular act of letting go to a continuous state of letting go. You have survived the unbearable friction. Now, welcome to the space between the release and the rebuild. Welcome to the beautiful emptiness. It is time to learn how to live with open hands. Chapter summaries. The Journey Ahead prologue. The paradox this opening section introduces the unexpected vertigo and profound, terrifying grief that accompany the act of finally letting go. It explores the realization that while the release was necessary to survive, the struggle itself was often a fight against a ghost. It welcomes the reader to the surreal, beautiful emptiness found between the initial release and the rebuilding of one's life. Part 1. Finding Sanctuary in the Silence. Chapter 1. The rush of the freefall. This chapter describes the immediate, electric invigoration of finally dropping a heavy burden. It details the fleeting, dizzying high of sudden autonomy before the reality of the descent sets in. Chapter 2. The Echoing Void. This section examines the terrifying silence and phantom limb syndrome of the soul that replaces the constant, deafening noise of carrying a burden. It highlights the ego's panic in empty spaces. It emphasizes the critical importance of sitting in the uncomfortable quiet rather than rushing to fill the void with new toxic dynamics. Chapter 3. Redefining Fullness. This chapter explores the necessary mindset shift from viewing empty space as a deficit or failure to seeing it as emotional capacity. It encourages readers to honor the void as a sacred holding area. It challenges the reader to allow their life's canvas to stay blank for a while to truly hold space for themselves. Part 2. Honoring Your Survival. Chapter 4. The survival instinct. This chapter reframes the act of letting go from a peaceful spiritual surrender to a raw, unpolished emergency exit. It explains how the breaking point arrives when the pain of holding on finally eclipses the terror of the void below. It validates that dropping the burden was a vital act of self-preservation, where your survival instinct finally chose you over the weight. Chapter 5. The Phantom Grip. This section explores the grief of realizing you were intensely attached to an illusion, such as the memory of a relationship or an outdated identity. It explains how we construct holographic overlays of what we wish were true because fantasies feel safer than raw reality. It advocates for treating this realization not with shame, but with unyielding compassion for your vast and hopeful heart. Chapter 6. Forgiving the Delay. This chapter addresses the bitter regret of lost time and the inner judgment of wondering why it took so long to walk away. It explains why holding on was actually a period of necessary gestation to gather empirical proof that a situation was unfixable. It asks the reader to radically forgive their past self, releasing timelines and recognizing they stayed exactly as long as they needed to. Part 3. The Quiet Strength of Open Hands. Chapter 7. The Disorientation of Freedom. This chapter describes the surreal, dreamlike state of existing without the central conflict that previously defined your identity. It explains why peace initially feels terrifyingly fragile and unnatural to a nervous system accustomed to packing the trenches. It frames navigating freedom as an acquired skill, requiring conscious physical therapy for the soul. Chapter 8. The Raw Ache of the Present. This section details the sharp, unmedicated reality of living without the emotional anesthesia that was required to endure past burdens. It warns against mistaking this new, intense sensitivity for a regression. It characterizes the piercing reality of the present as the agonizing but beautiful pain of frostbitten tissue thawing out and coming back to life. Chapter 9. Living with Open Hands. The final chapter explores the ultimate test of healing. engaging with new passions and relationships without clenching your fists to trap them. It teaches that trying to freeze the constant motion of life with a rigid grip creates friction and scars. It concludes that leaving the cage door open requires immense strength and love, allowing you to touch the world not as something to conquer, but as something to effortlessly release. Prologue, the paradox: we are taught that letting go is an act of subtraction, a simple math equation where you drop a weight and immediately you are lighter. They do not tell you about the vertigo. When you finally pry your fingers open and let the thing fall, the relationship, the resentment, the old version of yourself, the impossible expectation, the first breath you take is staggering. It is intoxicating. You are flooded with an invigorating rush of reclaimed life. I did it, you think. I am free. But then you look down at your hands. They are empty. And in that emptiness, there is a profound, terrifying grief. You spent so long holding on that the tension became your posture. The burden became your center of gravity. Without it, who are you? This is the paradox of release. It was entirely necessary to survive, yet looking back, you realize the struggle was unnecessary. You were fighting a ghost. The world without your burden feels entirely surreal, like walking on the moon. And yet, as your bare feet touch the soil of your new life, you have never felt anything so fiercely, undeniably real. Welcome to the space between the release and the rebuild. Welcome to the beautiful emptiness. Part 1. Finding sanctuary in the silence when we finally drop a heavy burden. The initial sensation is rarely immediate peace. It is a shocking, electric invigoration. However, as that adrenaline fades, it is entirely normal to feel a sense of emotional indifference or numbness as the echoing void sets in. To find calm here, we must reframe how we view this emptiness. Our nervous systems are so accustomed to managing chaos that quiet can temporarily feel like a deficit. But this silence is not an absence of life. It is a biological exhale. By consciously deciding not to fill this new space with familiar pain or busy distractions, we transform the void from a place of fear into a sanctuary of healing. Allow your life's canvas to remain blank for a while. The numbness will eventually lift, and in its place, a quiet, unforced capacity for joy will gently take root. Chapter 1. The rush of the freefall. There is a distinct, measurable moment when the grip finally fails. For months, perhaps years, your knuckles have been white. You have spent an agonizing amount of your life's energy calculating how to maintain your hold on a situation, a relationship, or an identity that was slowly pulling you under. You bargained. You adjusted your grip. You judged yourself for not being strong enough to hold on, and you judged yourself for being too weak to let go. And then, whether by choice, by exhaustion, or by the sheer force of reality, the fingers open. Self-help narratives often describe this as a gentle drifting away, like a leaf falling from a tree. But true release is rarely so passive. It is a freefall. The immediate sensation is not peace. It is a shocking, electric invigoration. It is the feeling of breaking the surface of the water after holding your breath until your lungs burned. The air is cold, sharp, and so intensely rich that it almost hurts to breathe it in. This is the rush of the freefall. When you drop the weight you were carrying, the energy you were using to sustain that burden doesn't just vanish, it returns to you. Suddenly, you have a surplus. The world, which had narrowed down to the size of whatever you were clenching in your fists, violently expands. Colors seem brighter. The constraints of your daily routines suddenly feel malleable. You look at the open door of your cage and realize, with a dizzying wave of adrenaline, that you can actually walk through it. In these early hours and days of release, you are untouchable. You are high on your own liberation. You have done the impossible thing. You have survived the severing. You tell yourself that the hardest part is over. You believe that the lightness you feel is the final destination. You let the wind rush past your face, completely enamored with the speed of your own descent, entirely unaware that the ground is approaching, and that soon the noise of the wind will stop, leaving you in a devastating, echoing silence. But for now, you fly. And you must allow yourself to fly. Because this invigoration, this brilliant, fleeting high of sudden autonomy, is the first proof you have that you are still alive. It's almost comical how light we become in those first few moments, bobbing like an untethered helium balloon at a carnival. The world suddenly looks like a sprawling playground rather than an obstacle course, and even the air feels a bit fizzy, like champagne on a Tuesday morning. This sudden buoyancy is a gentle nod from the universe, a sweet reminder that underneath all that heavy lifting, a remarkably buoyant spirit was just waiting for its moment to float. The dizzying wave of adrenaline might make it seem silly to smile at nothing while walking down the street, but that is simply the delightful side effect of dropping the invisible luggage. There is a playful rhythm to realizing the sky hasn't fallen just because you stopped holding it up. This newfound, breezy momentum is a wonderful companion, sweeping in to offer a refreshing dance with gravity before the deeper work of settling down even begins. Chapter 2. The echoing void the adrenaline always burns off. It is a biological inevitability. The wind stops rushing past your ears. The dizzying high of the freefall gently, or sometimes abruptly, deposits you onto solid ground. You look around expecting the world to look different because you feel different. But the world is just standing there, utterly ordinary. And then you hear it, the silence. When you carry a heavy burden for a long time, it creates a constant background noise in your life. The anxiety of maintaining it, the resentment of carrying it, the mental gymnastics required to justify it, it is a deafening roar that drowns out everything else. When you finally drop the weight, that roar vanishes. But it is not replaced by peaceful serenity. It is replaced by an echoing void. It is the ringing in your ears after a siren has finally been turned off. This is where the emptiness sets in, heavy and cold. You look at your open hands, and instead of seeing freedom, you see absence. We do not talk enough about the phantom limb syndrome of the soul. When you let go of something massive, even if that thing was actively destroying you, your psyche still expects it to be there. You wake up in the morning bracing for a fight that is already over. You reach out to touch a wound that has finally been stitched closed. You feel a sudden, terrifying panic because you are no longer carrying the rock that used to anchor you to the ground. Without the weight, you feel dangerously untethered. The hardest truth to swallow in the aftermath of release is that our burdens often become our identities. We construct our entire sense of self around what we are surviving, what we are fighting, or what we are trying to fix. In my book Unbound, we learn to heal beyond judgment, but here in the void, a new kind of judgment creeps in. We judge ourselves for missing the very cage we just escaped. We judge the emptiness. Who am I if I am no longer the victim of this story? Who am I if I am no longer the savior trying to keep this together? Who am I if I am not in pain? The instinct, almost immediately, is to fill the void. The ego panics in the face of empty space. It wants to rush out and find a new obsession, a new toxic dynamic, a new overwhelming project, or a new anxiety, anything to put weight back into those empty hands so you can feel grounded again, so you know who you are. But the real work of healing beyond the hold is doing the exact opposite. You must sit in the empty room of your life. You must let it be uncomfortably quiet. You must resist the urge to buy cheap furniture to fill the corners just because you are afraid of the echo. You have to grieve the loss of the familiar, even if the familiar was a nightmare. The emptiness is not a deficit. It is the clearing of the land. It is the prerequisite for anything new, true, and beautiful to grow, but before you can plant, you must learn to stand in the barren field and simply breathe the quiet air. When the deafening roar of the old burden finally vanishes, the sheer quiet might initially feel like arriving at a surprise party a week early. A little awkward, very silent, and mostly spent wondering where the music went. Our minds, experiencing that curious phantom limb syndrome of the soul, might try to invent an imaginary soundtrack just to keep the old routine going. It is perfectly okay to chuckle at our own busy brains as they try to stir the pot of a completely empty kitchen, looking for ingredients that are no longer there. There is a subtle, cozy magic in letting that quiet stretch out, knowing that this emptiness is not a deficit. Think of it like taking off a very tight pair of shoes. The feet might tingle, and the floor might feel unusually cold, but the absolute relief of wiggling those toes is undeniable. Embracing this roomy silence offers a gentle, unhurried space to just sip tea and watch the dust motes dance, with absolutely nowhere to be. Chapter 3. Redefining fullness. The transition from terror to peace does not announce itself with a parade. It does not arrive as a sudden, blinding revelation. Instead, it sneaks in through the back door of your daily routine, waiting for a quiet, unremarkable moment to tap you on the shoulder. For weeks, you have been staring into the echoing void, feeling the phantom weight of what you released. But then, a Tuesday morning arrives. You wake up, and for a fraction of a second, your body forgets to brace for impact. You brew your coffee. You watch the steam curl into the morning light. And you realize with a sudden, soft clarity that there is no crisis to manage today. No one to appease, no argument to rehearse, no facade to maintain. The silence in the room is no longer ringing. It is just quiet. This is the first taste of the emptiness shifting from a punishment into a sanctuary. It is a biological exhale. For so long, your nervous system has been operating in a state of chronic defense, treating the heavy burden as a necessary armor. When the armor first came off, the air felt too cold against your exposed skin. But in these quiet moments, you finally feel the warmth of the sun on your bare shoulders. The emptiness stops feeling like a vacuum sucking the oxygen out of your life and begins to feel like a deep, unobstructed breath. However, noticing this relief is only the first step. To truly heal beyond the hold, you must follow this. Passive relief with an intentional, radical mindset shift. You must redefine what fullness actually means. When we are trapped in the cycle of holding on, we confuse chaos with purpose. We equate a heavy heart with a full life. We believe that if our hands are full, even if they are full of broken glass, we are somehow productive, needed, or valid. The void terrifies us because we have been conditioned to view empty space as a failure, as a lack, as poverty. But look closely at your empty hands. Look at the space in your calendar, the quiet in your mind, the emotional bandwidth you suddenly have at your disposal. This is not a deficit. This is capacity. You are standing before a blank canvas. At first glance, a blank canvas is deeply intimidating. It demands that you take responsibility for what happens next. You can no longer blame the heavy burden for your lack of progress because the burden is gone. The brush is entirely in your hand. This requires a conscious, daily decision. I will not fill this space with familiar pain just because it is comfortable. I will not invite chaos back in just to feel full. Seeing the emptiness as a canvas means honoring the void as a sacred holding area. It means giving yourself permission to let the canvas stay blank for a while. You do not need to immediately sketch out a new 5-year plan, a new relationship, or a new identity. You are allowed to just sit in the studio and mix the paints. Let the emptiness stretch out before you. Let it be vast and unwritten. You are no longer holding the weight of the world. You are holding space for yourself. And slowly, you will discover that a life with room to breathe is the fullest life of all. Staring at a newly blank canvas, which can initially feel deeply intimidating, is sometimes like trying to remember a password to an account you haven't used in years. A mix of confusion and a sneaky suspicion that you are doing it wrong. Yet, there is something wonderfully liberating about realizing you aren't expected to paint a masterpiece by sundown. Instead of a daunting task, this emptiness might just be a comfortable hammock, perfectly strung up between the trees of what was and what will be, offering a lovely spot to simply rest. It is quite a delightful pivot to redefine fullness, moving away from the belief that if our hands are full, we are somehow productive. When we stop measuring our worth by how many plates we can spin at once, the sudden availability of time becomes less like a threatening void and more like a gentle invitation to dawdle. Finding fullness in the simple act of watching clouds or enjoying a slow, rambling walk is a gentle reminder that we are allowed to simply exist, unhurried and perfectly complete just as we are. Part 2. Honoring your survival. A major hurdle in finding lasting confidence is the heavy judgment we place on ourselves for holding on to an illusion for so long. The grief of hindsight can make the struggle feel tragically unnecessary. Healing requires us to extend radical, unyielding compassion to our past selves. Releasing your grip was a raw, vital act of self-preservation where your survival instinct finally chose you. The time you spent holding on was not wasted. It was an era of necessary gestation. You had to gather undeniable, empirical proof that the situation was unfixable so you could walk away without being haunted by what-ifs. When you look back at the version of you who endured that friction, do not look with regret, but with a profound, aching reverence. They carried an impossible weight so that you wouldn't have to carry it forever. Chapter 4. The survival instinct. We like to imagine that letting go is a choice born of profound, serene spiritual maturity. We picture ourselves standing on a mountaintop, closing our eyes, and peacefully releasing our attachments to the wind because we have finally achieved a state of enlightened grace. The truth is usually much less poetic and much more primal. We rarely let go because we suddenly become wise. We let go because the alternative is destruction. This brings us to the second great paradox of release. It is both deeply necessary and tragically unnecessary. But before we can grieve the unnecessary years we spent clenching our fists, we must honor the brute, necessary biology of the breaking point. For a long time, holding on felt like survival. Whether you were holding together a fractured relationship, maintaining a punishing standard of perfection, or clinging to a version of reality that was no longer true, your grip was a trauma response. You held on because a terrified, ancient part of your brain convinced you that if you let go, you would cease to exist. You believed the weight you were carrying was the very thing anchoring you to the earth. So, you endured. You normalized the agony in your forearms. You ignored the splintering of your own bones. You convinced yourself that the blistering friction of holding onto something that actively wanted to pull away, or something that was actively pulling you under, was simply the price of love or success or loyalty. But the human spirit has a fail-safe. It has an absolute threshold for suffering. The breaking point arrives when the math of your survival finally flips. For months or years, the fear of the drop was greater than the pain of the grip. But slowly, inevitably, the pain of holding on eclipses the terror of the void below. You realize, in a moment of terrifying, crystalline clarity, that the thing you are holding onto to save your life is exactly what is drowning you. Letting go in this moment is not a gentle spiritual surrender. It is an emergency exit. It is the body pulling the ripcord. It is the raw, unpolished survival instinct kicking in and screaming, "If I do not open my hands right now, I am going to die." Perhaps not a physical death, but the death of your joy, your autonomy, your spark, your soul. To heal beyond the hold, you must reframe the narrative of your release. You did not give up. You did not fail. You were not too weak to carry the burden to the finish line. You executed a vital, necessary act of self-preservation. Your survival instinct woke up, looked at the crushing, unsustainable weight in your hands, and finally did the bravest thing it could possibly do. It chose you over the burden. Recognizing this necessity is crucial. It is the armor you will need to wear when the guilt inevitably tries to creep back in. Because soon, the realization of how necessary the release was will be met by the haunting realization of how unnecessary the struggle had been all along. We often imagine personal growth as a majestic, glowing ascent up a mountain, complete with a choir and a perfectly timed sunset, rather than the raw, unpolished survival instinct it truly is. The reality of finally dropping a heavy burden is usually far less cinematic and much closer to tossing a broken lawnmower to the curb on trash day. Messy, completely unglamorous, but oh so necessary. There is a deep, comforting humor in acknowledging that sometimes our greatest leaps forward happen simply because we were too tired to take another step in the wrong direction. Recognizing that releasing the grip was an act where the survival instinct chose you over the burden is like finally high-fiving the very tired, very practical inner roommate who finally said enough is enough. It's a beautifully human, imperfectly perfect mechanism that cares more about our breathing than our aesthetic grace. Finding peace in this slightly clumsy exit strategy allows a soft, warm appreciation to grow for the incredible, stubborn resilience that decided it was finally time to choose comfort over chaos. Chapter 5. The Phantom Grip. Once the dust settles from the emergency exit of your release, a new, more insidious kind of grief sets in. It is the grief of hindsight. Standing in the safety of your new, empty-handed life, you look back at the agonizing months or years you spent holding on. You examine the bruises on your spirit and the time you cannot get back. And then, the fog clears entirely, revealing the most heartbreaking truth of all. The thing you were gripping so desperately wasn't even there. You were holding onto a ghost. This is the phantom grip. It is the sobering realization that the object of your intense attachment was often an illusion. You were not holding onto the reality of a relationship. You were holding onto the memory of how it started, or the desperate fantasy of how it could be if only the other person would change. You were not holding onto a life path that fulfilled you. You were holding onto the security you thought it gave you, or the promise of a future payoff that was perpetually postponed. You were not holding onto your true self. You were gripping a rigid, outdated identity that kept you safe when you were younger, but was now suffocating you. The unnecessary, half of our paradox lives here. The struggle feels tragic because you realize you were pouring your life force into a mirage. You were acting as a human pillar to hold up a ceiling that had already collapsed years ago. We cling to illusions because, ironically, they feel safer than the truth. A fantasy is predictable, and a memory cannot surprise you with new betrayal. Facing the raw reality of the present, that the love is gone, that the dream has expired, that the environment is toxic, requires a level of vulnerability that our nervous systems initially reject. So, we construct a holographic overlay of what we wish were true, and we grip that hologram with a deathly force. But holograms have no substance. The harder you squeeze, the more empty your hands actually are. The friction burns you feel aren't from the object itself, but from your own nails digging into your palms as you try to grasp smoke. When this realization finally hits, the immediate reaction is almost always profound shame. We judge ourselves harshly for our blindness. How could I have been so foolish? How did I waste so much time watering a dead plant? But this is exactly where the core tenets of outgrowing judgment must be resurrected. You cannot heal beyond the hold if you replace your old burden with a new burden of self-flagellation. You must look at your phantom grip not with scorn, but with deep, unyielding compassion. You held on to the illusion because your heart was so vast, so incredibly hopeful, that it believed it could love a mirage into solid reality. You held on because you believed in potential. You held on because you are loyal. Those are not character flaws, they are misplaced superpowers. Acknowledging the phantom grip is a critical threshold in truly letting go. It is admitting that you cannot lose what was never truly there to begin with. The illusion has shattered, yes, but the capacity for hope, for endurance, and for immense love, that was real all along, and it belongs entirely to you. Discovering the phantom grip, the realization that you were pouring energy into an illusion, can feel a bit like waving enthusiastically at someone across the street, only to realize they were waving at the person behind you. It brings a flush of silly realization, but beneath that is a testament to an incredibly imaginative and optimistic heart. It takes a special kind of magical thinking to paint a masterpiece over a blank wall, and realizing the paint was invisible all along doesn't diminish the beautiful intention behind the brushstrokes. There is a gentle relief in finally letting go of the need to play pretend and no longer holding onto a holographic overlay of what we wished were true. It is kind of like taking off a heavy, elaborate costume after a long school play. The realization that the heavy lifting was for a phantom might bring a sigh, but it also brings the cozy assurance that no more energy needs to be spent propping up the scenery. It leaves behind a soft, appreciative smile for our own dedication, paired with the delightful reality that the actual world, though unscripted, is much less exhausting to inhabit. Chapter 6. Forgiving the delay. There is a specific, bitter flavor to the grief that follows the realization that you were holding onto an illusion. It is the grief of lost time. Once the phantom grip is acknowledged, the mind immediately begins to audit the past. You look at the calendar and calculate the weeks, months, or decades spent agonizing over a dynamic that was never going to work. The chorus of inner judgment roars back to life with a new accusation. Why did it take you so long? You ask yourself why you didn't walk away the first time your boundaries were crossed. Why you stayed when the writing was clearly on the wall. Why you poured your precious, unrecoverable energy into a black hole when everyone around you could see it was futile. The regret can be suffocating. It makes the unnecessary part of the paradox feel like a personal failure, a testament to your own naivety or weakness. But to truly heal beyond the hold, you must radically forgive the delay. We operate under the cruel misconception that letting go is simply a matter of logic. We believe that the moment we realize something is bad for us, we should have the immediate strength to drop it. But human beings do not run on pure logic. We run on complex, deeply ingrained emotional survival systems. You cannot pry a green apple from a branch without tearing the wood. It must endure the weather, the sun, and the rain until it is ripe enough to fall with the gentlest breeze. Your psyche operates the exact same way. The time you spent holding on was not wasted. It was a period of necessary gestation. You were not being foolish. You were gathering evidence. When we are deeply attached to something, especially something toxic or misaligned, a part of us will always try to rationalize staying. If you had let go prematurely, before every shadow of a doubt had been extinguished, you would have spent the rest of your life haunted by the what-ifs. You would have reached back for the burden, convinced that maybe, just maybe, if you had tried a little harder, things would have been different. You stayed exactly as long as you needed to prove to your own heart that there was nothing left to save. You endured the friction until your internal database had collected enough undeniable empirical proof that the situation was unfixable. Every disappointment, every broken promise, and every moment of silent agony was a necessary data point. They were the weights slowly stacking on the scale until it finally tipped, allowing your survival instinct to take over and force your hands open. Look back at the version of yourself who held on for too long. Do not look at them with contempt. Look at them with a profound, aching reverence. That past version of you carried an impossible weight so that you wouldn't have to carry it forever. They endured the darkness until they could finally build the bridge to the light you are standing in now. They did the agonizing, exhausting work of trying every single key on the ring so that you, today, can walk away with absolute certainty that none of them fit the lock. Forgive the delay. Release the timeline. The journey to the release was not a minute too late or a second too early. It took exactly as long as it needed to take for you to become the person who could finally say, *enough. The internal critic loves to show up with a stopwatch and a clipboard, eagerly auditing the past to calculate the lost time. But perhaps we can imagine that overly punctual part of ourselves as a well-meaning but slightly annoying tour guide who simply doesn't appreciate a good wandering path. We can gently pat that critic on the head, knowing that sometimes it takes a few extra laps around the block just to be absolutely sure we've seen all the sights before heading home. There is a wonderful, soft grace in accepting that we operate on an internal season, gathering the necessary data points until we are truly ready. Rushing a sunrise never works, and neither does rushing the heart's quiet journey toward clarity. Embracing the timeline exactly as it happened feels like wrapping a warm, forgiving blanket around our shoulders, finally agreeing that the long way around was exactly the path we needed to walk. Part 3. The quiet strength of open hands as you step into your newfound freedom. The world may feel surreal and destabilizing. Without the protective emotional anesthesia you used to survive, the reality of the present moment can feel piercingly sharp. If you feel overwhelmed or strangely detached, recognize that this is not a regression. It is the deeply human pain of thawing out. True, lasting peace is found when we transition from the singular act of letting go to a continuous state of living with open hands. This means giving yourself permission to experience the world without the crippling anxiety of trying to control it. You can love deeply, engage fully, and allow joy and sorrow to pass through your life naturally, without building them a permanent home in your chest. Your hands are empty, resting, and remarkably strong, ready to experience the world without fear. Chapter 7. The disorientation of freedom. You have survived the freefall. You have sat in the echoing void. You have forgiven yourself for the years spent clutching a ghost. Now, you stand up and attempt to walk into the rest of your life, and you immediately lose your balance. Welcome to the disorientation of freedom. This is the beginning of the surreal, the bizarre, dreamlike state of existing in a world where the central conflict of your life has suddenly vanished. When you wear chains for a long time, your muscles adapt to their weight. You learn to walk with a specific, heavy gait. You factor the resistance of the iron into every movement, every conversation, every choice. When the chains are finally struck off, you do not immediately sprint into the sunlit meadow. You stumble. You lift your legs too high. You feel dangerously light, as if a strong gust of wind might blow you right off the face of the earth. In the absence of your struggle, reality begins to feel like a simulation. For so long, your days were defined by what you were fighting against. Your identity was forged in the fire of resistance. You were the survivor, the peacemaker, the tireless worker, the martyr. Your purpose, however painful, was clear: manage the crisis. Now there is no crisis. You wake up and there is no fire to put out, no one to appease, no impossible standard to desperately reach for. The war is over. But your nervous system is still wearing combat boots, packing the trenches, squinting at the horizon and waiting for an attack that is never going to come. This is why peace, at first, feels deeply unnatural. It feels boring. Worse, it feels terrifyingly fragile, like a trap waiting to be sprung. You catch yourself almost missing the chaos, not because the chaos was good, but because it was a language you were fluent in. You knew how to navigate the storm. You do not yet know how to navigate the calm. The surreal nature of letting go is waking up to realize that your prison door has been wide open for days, but you have still been packing in a 6x8 square. To move through this disorientation, you must understand that freedom is not an instinct. It is an acquired skill. You are an astronaut who has just returned to Earth after years in zero gravity. You have to undergo physical therapy for your soul. You must consciously relearn how to walk without bracing for impact. Be exceedingly gentle with yourself in this surreal landscape. When peace feels uncomfortable, do not run back to the familiar chaos just to feel grounded. Let yourself be disoriented. Let yourself feel dizzy in the wide-open space. You are not losing your mind. You are simply experiencing the staggering, unfamiliar sensation of having nothing left to fight. Waking up to a day in a bizarre, dreamlike state where there is no fire to put out is like stepping off a long treadmill. The ground seems to be moving even though you are standing perfectly still. The mind, dressed in its little emotional hard hat, might wander around looking for a problem to solve, feeling quite underemployed when it only finds peace. It is okay to laugh kindly at our own shadowboxing, watching our thoughts throw punches at the air until they realize they can finally sit down and have a cup of tea. Navigating this newborn freedom, knowing that our nervous system is still wearing combat boots, is a bit like a toddler learning to walk on a bouncy castle. Everything is safe, but the footing is completely unpredictable. The sheer abundance of space might cause a few dizzy spells, but there is no rush to find the perfect balance right away. Letting this slightly goofy, unanchored feeling wash over us allows for a gentle, playful exploration of a world that is suddenly, wonderfully, and softly open. Chapter 8. The raw ache of the present. There is a consequence to dropping your armor. Suddenly, the wind touches your bare skin. In the previous chapter, we navigated the surreal, dreamlike disorientation of sudden freedom. But as the fog of that disorientation begins to lift, it is replaced by an experience that is the exact opposite. The dream abruptly ends, and you are thrust into a world that is shockingly, almost aggressively, real. When you are locked in the agonizing struggle of holding on, you cannot afford to feel everything. The human nervous system cannot process the acute pain of a splintering grip while simultaneously appreciating the beauty of a sunset or the subtle nuances of a Tuesday afternoon. To survive the prolonged friction of your burden, you had to administer a kind of emotional anesthesia. You numbed the periphery so you could focus all your energy on the central crisis. You built a thick, calloused buffer between yourself and the world just to endure it. But when the burden is dropped, the anesthesia begins to wear off. The buffer dissolves. Suddenly, you are standing in the present moment without any chemical numbing, without any protective delusions, and without the all-consuming distraction of your former pain. You meet the world exactly as it is, and you discover a startling truth. Unmedicated reality is incredibly sharp. This is the raw ache of the present. It is the so real half of our final paradox. It is the sensation of a limb waking up after being asleep for years. It is a spiritual pins and needles. Without the heavy, dulling weight you used to carry, every sensation is magnified. A simple conversation with a friend suddenly moves you to tears. A harsh word from a stranger cuts deeper than it should. The taste of your food, the temperature of the air, the silence of your empty room, everything is broadcast in piercing, high-definition clarity. At first, this intensity feels like an assault. Your newly unarmored skin is highly sensitive, and the raw friction of daily life can feel abrasive. You might mistake this ache for a regression. You might think, I let go so I wouldn't hurt anymore. Why does everything suddenly feel so heavy? But this ache is not the pain of injury. It is the pain of thawing out. When frostbitten hands are finally brought near a fire, the return of blood flow is agonizing. The burning sensation is not a sign that the fire is destroying you. It is a sign that the tissue is coming back to life. The sharp, piercing reality of the present moment is the blood rushing back into your soul. To heal beyond the hold, you must not flinch away from this sharpness. Do not reach for a new anesthetic. Do not try to blunt the edges of the world with new distractions. Let it be deeply, intensely real. Allow yourself to weep at the sheer beauty of an ordinary morning, and allow yourself to feel the clean, unmedicated grief of what you have lost. The ache is the undeniable proof that you are no longer surviving a ghost. You are finally, fiercely, living in the world. When the emotional winter coat finally comes off and the protective delusions dissolve, every little breeze feels like a profound, sweeping gust of wind. It is as if someone suddenly turned up the color saturation on the world, making the simplest of encounters feel incredibly vivid, sometimes to the point of a squeak or a sudden tear. This supersized sensitivity is just the heart's way of stretching its legs after a long nap, a delicate reawakening that treats a warm ray of sunshine or a friendly hello as a miraculous front-page news event. It is quite beautiful, in a slightly tender way, to realize that this prickle of feeling is just the soul waking up, much like the agony of frostbitten hands thawing near a fire. Just as a hot bowl of soup brings a lovely, startling warmth to cold hands, the raw textures of everyday life might feel intense, but they are incredibly nourishing. Allowing these bright, crisp sensations to simply roll through without needing to turn down the volume invites a quiet, confident joy in simply being able to feel the weather again. Chapter 9. Living with open hands, we treat letting go as an event, a singular, Herculean task to be checked off a spiritual to-do list. We believe that once we survive the freefall, navigate the echoing void, and thaw out in the raw ache of the present, the work is finally done. We dust off our empty hands and expect to walk into a frictionless future. But life abhors a vacuum. The world will inevitably bring new things to your door. New relationships, new passions, new responsibilities, and new dreams will ask to be held. This is where the final, greatest test of your healing begins. Because the moment something beautiful, valuable, or fragile is placed into your hands, your deepest, most ancient reflex will be to clench your fists around it. You will want to lock it down. You will want to grip it tightly so you never have to lose it, forgetting that this exact grip is what caused your agony in the first place. Healing beyond the hold requires a fundamental shift in how you interact with the world. You must move from the asterisk act of letting go to an asterisk state of letting go. You must learn to live with open hands. Living with open hands is the mastery of the beautiful emptiness. It is the understanding that you can hold something deeply, love it profoundly, and engage with it fully without curling your fingers around it to trap it. Imagine holding water. If you cup your hands gently, the water rests there, cool and sustaining. But the moment you panic and squeeze your fists tight to claim it, the water violently slips through your fingers, leaving you with nothing but wet, empty hands. Everything in this life is transient. The people we love, the circumstances we enjoy, the very cells in our bodies, they are all in a constant state of motion. When we try to freeze that motion with a rigid grip, we create friction. And friction causes scars. But when your hands are open, things can enter and exit your life without tearing your skin. You allow people the freedom to be exactly who they are, without demanding they conform to the shape of your expectations. You allow joy to visit without the crippling anxiety of when it will leave. You allow sorrow to pass through without building it a permanent home in your chest. Living with open hands does not mean you do not care. It is the exact opposite. It takes infinitely more strength, more trust, and more profound love to leave the cage door open than it does to lock it. It means looking at the people and the passions in your life and saying, I choose you today, and I will let you choose me, but I will not hold you hostage to my fear of being without you. Fear is the root of all weakness. It is fear that tells us to grip until our knuckles bleed, terrified of what will happen if we let go. But you have survived the unbearable weight of holding on. You have survived the terrifying vertigo of the release. You have faced the phantom illusions of your past and the razor-sharp reality of your present. Now, look down at your hands. They are empty, yes, but they are no longer barren. They are open, resting, and remarkably strong. They are finally ready to touch the world, not as something to conquer or cling to, but as something to experience, honor, and effortlessly release. This is the quiet miracle of the aftermath. This is the healing beyond the hold. Thinking of life as a delightful, ever-flowing stream rather than a vault to be guarded takes a surprising amount of pressure off the realization that the world will inevitably bring new things to your door. It is like discovering you don't actually have to catch the butterfly to appreciate its wings. You can just sit quietly on the porch and watch it flutter by. This breezy, open-palmed approach turns every new experience into a pleasant visitor rather than a permanent resident we have to clean up after. There is a quiet, steady rhythm to living with open hands, akin to resting in a gentle hammock that sways with the breeze instead of fighting it. The beauty of this soft surrender is that it leaves the heart delightfully uncluttered and remarkably resilient, ready to welcome whatever comes next with a soft smile. It brings a deep, comforting sigh of relief, knowing that the most courageous thing we can ever do is simply let the world breathe in and out, right along with us. Fear is the root of all weakness registered. By the author, Unbound Healing Beyond Judgment Healing is not a quiet surrender. It is a rebellion. We are sold a sanitized version of recovery, one where the victim fades quietly into the background, lets go of their anger, and forgives those who hurt them. But what happens when the systems meant to protect you are flawed, unlawful, or blind to the truth? What happens when you are forced to fight for your own survival against the very institutions built to uphold justice? In Unbound, Healing Beyond Judgment, author, human rights advocate, and MS Legacy International Australia finalist Marcia BNoose dismantles the myth of the perfect victim. This is not a gentle guide to returning to an ordinary life. It is a gritty, tactical field guide for the battle-tested. Drawing from her own grueling experiences confronting systemic betrayal and advocating for marginalized voices, Marcia provides a relentless blueprint for unbinding the barbed wire of societal expectations. Inside this manifesto, you will learn how to use anger as an architect, stop fearing your righteous rage, channel it into a hyper-focused, cold energy to study the rules, expose corruption, and construct an impenetrable fortress of boundaries. Reject toxic forgiveness. Challenge the mainstream demand that you must forgive your abusers to find peace. True healing means decoupling your future from their absolution and redirecting your grace inward. Reclaim your voice. Silence is a manufactured condition. Learn the tactical rebellion of documenting the raw truth and building an impenetrable paper trail to prove that ink outlasts bureaucracy. Wear the armor of authenticity. Discard the visually unassuming uniform of the defeated. Use bold aesthetics and unyielding presence to instantly shift the power dynamic in any courtroom or boardroom. Build your sanctuary. You cannot live your entire life standing guard on the battlements. Guard your absolute right to disconnect and create a peaceful, creative space to rest without guilt. Whether you are navigating institutional overreach, fighting for bodily autonomy, or simply refusing to be silenced, Unbound proves that true heroes are messy, complicated, and absolutely unbreakable. You do not need an institution's permission to find your peace. Step out of the crosshairs, embrace your inner rebel, and become the unapologetic architect of your own survival. Grab your copy of Unbound today and rewrite the law of your own life. An individual is not subject to any civil, criminal, or administrative liability for making a public interest disclosure. It is an offense to take a reprisal, or to threaten to take a reprisal, against a person because of a public interest disclosure, including a proposed or a suspected public interest disclosure. The federal court or federal circuit court may make orders for civil remedies, including compensation, injunctions, and reinstatement of employment, if a reprisal is taken against a person because of a public interest disclosure, including a proposed or a suspected public interest disclosure. It is an offense to disclose the identity of an individual who makes a public interest disclosure. Public Interest Disclosure Act 2013, No. 133, 2013, Part 2. Subdivision A, Immunity from Liability.